share. Mr. Anschutz even owns small newspapers, including the Weekly Standard. Countdown has even identified one S-Corp owner whose reclusive founder and chairman actually works out of these very NBC headquarters in New York. Hi. Technically, I'm a small business. As promised, let's bring in Pulitzer Prize-winning tax reporter David K. Johnston, the author of Free Lunch, How the Wealthiest Americans Enrich Themselves at Government Expense and Stick You with the Bill. He's also a columnist for Tax Notes. David, thanks for your time again tonight.
Thank you, Keith.
First of all, have we explained what's going on correctly, and can you flesh it out a little bit for us?
Everything you said was correct, and it's actually much worse than this because in addition to being pass-throughs, many of these enterprises benefit from all sorts of tax rules that allow them to take money now and then pay their taxes 10 or 20 years in the future. That's an enormous benefit and a subsidy that ordinary working people who have their taxes taken out of their paycheck before they get it are in effect financing for these businesses. In addition, about 900 of these small corporations, it looks like from the statistics, paid no income taxes even at the personal level of the owner.
When we think about small businesses colloquially, or as we would say, using English, we think of the mom and pop hardware store. We think of some online company that's run out of somebody's home. Some employee somewhere is trying to break out on his own and starts his own company selling the proverbial widget. Are any of those kinds of businesses in the range that Republicans are trying to protect in their supposed so-called benefits for so-called small businesses?
Well, Keith, yes, there are some. I mean, you can have an author. Maybe my next book, I'll make enough money to come under your opprobrium for it.
Yep.
There are people who may own a chain of fast food stores or a particularly successful group of liquor stores, but they're a very small portion of this. There are about, as you mentioned, 15,000 S-Corps that have an average revenue of $150 million. And then there's another 18,000 partnerships that have average revenue of about $137 million.
These rich guys, though, paying the top rates, they'd have to pay a lot more in taxes if the Democrats don't renew the top Bush tax cuts, right?
Well, yes and no. They do, after all, have access to tax shelters. There are all sorts of fine rules. The reason the tax code is so thick has nothing to do with ordinary Americans. It has to do with favors bought with campaign donations. But yes, overall, they will pay higher taxes, which will go to provide better infrastructure so they can move their goods and services, educate people so they have people to buy their products, etc.
Just putting aside for a second the Orwellian quality of this whole thing, that peace is war and big business is small business. In terms of hiring, regardless of the size of business, the GOP argument is that raising taxes would curtail new jobs, would curtail hiring. Is that really the biggest factor, or don't businesses wind up deducting those costs in any case from their own taxes and their own expenses?
Well, economic theory says there should be less job creation when we raise taxes. Well, Bill Clinton had Congress raise taxes in 1993, and 8 years later, they were cut, and again 10 years later under President Bush. During Bush's 8 years, 3.5 million jobs were created. During Clinton's years, 6 times as many, 21 million jobs. In fact, during the Clinton years, more jobs were created in those 8 years than in the 20 years of Ronald Reagan and both Bushes in the White House. So I think you have a tough time making that argument. Mm-hmm. What matters is what the taxes are spent on.
Last question. Is there law or code somewhere that defines what a small business is? Is there actually just a semantical violation here, or is there something more to it?
No, this is essentially semantical. I mean, the SBA says if you have 500 or fewer employees, you're a small business. So certainly by the definition of the Small Business Administration, many of the companies that we've talked about are not small businesses. And remember that small businesses also destroy many jobs. It's a relatively handful of little companies that go on to become big companies. The gazelles, they're known as, like, say, FedEx, that went from nowhere to being a big company very quickly.
David K. Johnston, professor at Syracuse University. Great thanks for your time tonight and for your help on all of this.
Glad to be here.
Here's another shock. The billionaires who benefit from being small businesses, trademark, use their money to fund Republican causes like tax cuts for small businesses, trademark, like them. It's not just those small businessmen, the Koch brothers. Another small businessman we mentioned is funding Pennsylvania Republicans, and one we haven't even told you about yet is funneling his tax savings to Karl Rove. We continue with this next. We've already shown you how the Koch brothers, by quasi-legal definition, own a peck of the small businesses Republicans are trying to funnel tax cuts to. Next, how they and other small businessmen are in turn funneling campaign funds back to Republicans. She admits what we all know, but Fox doesn't want anybody to confirm. Their supposed news network constitutes a fundraising arm of the Republican Party. Also tonight, he loses it over Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the video you must see to believe. And this Georgia senator tonight confirms an anonymous homophobic slur posted on an LGBT website came from inside his senatorial offices. Continuing our not-so-small business report with Chris Hayes next. Salon.com reported this week that 91% of the money for Karl Rove's new attack ad group comes from billionaires, 3 billionaires. And in our fourth story tonight, continuing our special report about how the term small business is an utter misnomer. The Chicago Tribune is technically a small business, as is the world's largest construction concern, Bechtel. Countdown has also learned that one of those Rove funding billionaires is, you guessed it, one of those small businesses whose taxes Republicans want to keep at Bush-era levels. He's Carl Lindner, who gave Rove $400,000 last month and who made his $1.7 billion fortune through United Dairy Farmers, a small business with hundreds of stores and one of the top 15 ice cream brands in the country. Number 582 on Forbes' list of the world's billionaires. Not that far below number 463, Henry Hillman, whose family bankrolls Pennsylvania Republicans with proceeds from his small investment business, which Forbes says makes him worth more than $2 billion. Let's turn now to MSNBC contributor Chris Hayes, the Washington editor of The Nation magazine. Chris, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
How does the tax cut debate change now that we know what the Republicans mean by small business and to what degree the public has been had?
Well, you hope that Democrats hammer on this. I mean, what's interesting is that even before this, right, even given the messaging that the Republicans were doing in this completely disingenuous small business chicanery that you revealed, they were still on the wrong side of public opinion. Mm-hmm. I mean, the fact of the matter is people understand the number 250,000, right? They understand that we are talking about a group of people that's quite small and doing quite well. And when you climb up the income scale, I mean, you start getting up to incomes that are, hedge fund people who are making $1 billion in income in a year. That's a flow. That's not wealth. That's annual income. People understand that. So public opinion was already on the side of progressives on this. The real question is whether the Democrats are going to politically force the issue. I mean, I think something like this, can get rid of whatever last vestiges of resistance there are, but it also exposes the political economy of the way this works and the way that upward redistribution has been sold, not just in this election cycle, but for the last 30 and 40 years.
Incidentally, thank you, Chris, for providing those home movies of your yacht and your champagne. Greg Sargent at Plumline reported that the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, is getting pressure still from the conservocrats, the conservative Democrats, who say that holding on to the middle-class tax cuts, holding the vote, is going to make them vulnerable on Election Day. And a lot of them are pushing to include these GOP tax cuts for the rich as well. The Democratic Congressman Brad Ellsworth of Indiana just said that today, said, get the issue off the table. It'll be much easier for us. How much crazier does that plan now look, now that we know who they'd be helping out by using that plan?
It is so politically, morally, logically bankrupt that it beggars belief. I mean, I wrote a feature for The Nation magazine last year, and I talked about the Blue Dogs, and the big hustle the Blue Dogs have is that they say, our big thing, we're united around one thing, which is deficits. That is the way that they trump themselves. That's their identity as a caucus. And what they are doing here now is to say, we want you to add $700 billion to the deficit over the next 10 years, and then much more in perpetuity, right? Because we're not talking about sunsetting any of this. This is out into the future as far as the eye can see. That's what they're taking a stand on. So it should never be reported. No one should ever say, never let it be said about the Blue Dogs that they care about the deficit. They do not care about the deficit. What they care about is representing the interests of wealthy people that give them lots of money, and or some, or themselves. I don't know. I'm not going to impute to them what their motives are, but what is clear is they don't care about deficits.
We have a